Now we're going to talk about building large applications. What I'm going to show you is how Gmails are built, how the Yahoo homepage is built. The Yahoo homepage is one of the greatest examples of JavaScript usage out there at the moment. I know not necessarily a lot of people in this room actually use it, but the Yahoo homepage is structured in such a way that every single component on there, everything that looks like a widget, is actually independently sandboxed and yet can still talk to each other. And if a single widget on that page breaks, the rest of the page doesn't. It can continue working. They can actually restart individual modules on that page directly from JavaScript and never have that page crashing. How awesome would it be to tell your employers that you can build an application that is very, very, very unlikely to ever crash? That's got some value to it, right? So let me show you how to build a large-scale application. Let's first define what a large application is. I've asked this question to many developers. I've asked these to developers who've been using JavaScript the past 10 years, and they've still had trouble coming up with an answer. This is mine. It's not necessarily the best or the right one. I hope it's at least a sensible answer. Large-scale JavaScript apps are non-trivial applications requiring significant developer effort to maintain, where most of the heavy lifting of data manipulation and display falls to the browser. So if you're working on an application and you find yourself in this situation, you may be developing a large application. I've talked about Gmail. I've talked about the fact that it's using dynamic dependencies. I've talked about the fact that you probably won't see Gmail crashing. What you'll see is the chat widget may say, okay, well, the internet connection has died. But it can still restart itself. It can still keep monitoring the connection to figure out, okay, well, now I can restart. And yet you can still use the rest of the application. Can we say that the applications we're building today are able to do that? Yahoo, which I've already talked about, they developed it in such a way that it's very unlikely to crash. They're actually able to restart modules, they're able to restart widgets, and keep an eye on everything that's going on, whilst every single bit of this page still being independent, so they can have different teams working on different parts of the page. So let's review your current architecture. Most of the people in this room, including me, probably have some aspect of perhaps custom widgets that they're using, maybe modules, maybe some sort of application core. You might be using MVC or one of those other patterns, and you might be using JavaScript libraries and toolkits like jQuery or something else. Remember that if you're working on something that's significantly non-trivial, it's important to spend as much time as possible planning out your architecture. It's usually nowhere near as simple as we first think. And I know that there's a lot of temptation to say, you know what, everyone's talking about Backbone, I'm going to start using that. What you should do instead is actually plan out your application. What is it going to do? What is the best set of patterns that make sense for me to implement this using? What's the best structural solution for me to try out? So here are some of the possible problems with what we're doing right now. How much of what we're writing right now is instantly reusable? If I went into any of the repos that you guys are working on right now, and I picked up a particular module or a particular widget, would I be able to use it in my own projects right away? And you have to think about that when you're working on large applications, because you're eventually going to grow. Hopefully your application and the company are going to grow. And with that mean more features, the application is going to get better, it's probably going to get bigger as well. And you have to wonder, okay, well, if more teams start working on this code base, perhaps it's going to mean other projects are going to start getting created out of it. And if there's significant investment going into creating modules that do things, let's say there's a module that takes care of spreadsheets, which is not an easy component to actually create. You want other parts of your company to still be able to use those things. Can single modules exist on their own independently, which we just covered? Can single modules be tested independently? Not enough JavaScript developers are testing their code these days. How many people here have not properly unit tested their code before? There we go. I unit test my code probably 50% of the time. The other 50% I just pray. But we should be developing things in a way that every module in our application can be independently tested properly. How much do modules that you write depend on other modules in the system? This comes back again to can modules exist on their own independently. This ties in with how tightly coupled is your application. If you want your application to be built in a way that's flexible, so that it can be easily changed later on, you do have to try considering how decoupled it is right now. And if it's not decoupled, if it's tightly created right now, try to decouple it. I'm going to show you some patterns and some solutions you can use to actually solve these problems. If specific parts of your application fail, can it still function? You'd be surprised how many very large applications these days can't do this. It's generally not easy to get this done properly. And I'm going to show you a solution for how you can get this done. And think long term. Although a lot of us right now probably use solutions like jQuery for DOM manipulation, who's to say that in a year or two something better isn't going to come around? Who's to say that whatever tools we're using to perhaps take care of the local storage management for our data sets or the templating we're using, who's to say that we're not going to want to switch those things out later on? If you're working on a small application, you probably don't have to worry about those things. If you want to work in an application which is going to grow, and you may be working on a medium-sized application that you're looking to perhaps get better over time, you have to wonder, okay, well, am I going to end up switching this out for something better later on? And I know that people are probably tired, it's getting late, but if you paid attention to this part of the presentation, at the very end, I'm going to show you how in one line of code you can switch an entire application from using jQuery to using Dojo, and Dojo to using jQuery. One line of code. This is perhaps the most important quote about any of the stuff I'm talking about today. The secret to building large applications is never build large applications. You should never be building applications that are bulky. You should be splitting up your modules into little independent pieces that are easy to look at, easy to read, easy to maintain, easy to test. So assemble those testable, hopefully bite-sized pieces, and that should make up your larger application. And the more tied components are to each other, the less reusable they're going to be. So this comes back to how reusable are the modules we're writing right now, the code we're writing right now. Something to think about. So we're going to take a very quick break to look at two patterns. We're going to take a look at the facade pattern and the mediator pattern. Even if you haven't actually read about these things before, chances are you're using a solution right now which does use them. jQuery is using the facade pattern. We're not going to go saying, hey, we use the facade pattern, but we use the facade pattern. I love Star Wars. Okay, so the facade pattern is all about the idea of providing a convenient high-level interface to a larger body of code. And the reason it's called a facade is that we want to hide the complexity behind whatever it is that we're writing. So I know you're not going to be able to necessarily see this, so let's zoom in a minute. So this is the private. This looks a little bit like the module pattern, right? It's got a private part to it, and then it's got a public interface that we're going to return. Let's zoom in on the important part. So this is the facade, and the way the facade works is that my public users don't actually have to know about anything that I'm doing in my previous slide. They don't have to know that there's a get or a set or a run or a jump. People don't care about that. What they care about is that they're able to actually pass information through to a function and have something work. So with the facade, I can have my private logic be as complex as I want, as simple or as complex as I want. And people don't have to be aware of all the different methods that are being run. Here, I guess very simple to jQuery's animate, for example. With jQuery's animate, there's a lot of other stuff going on behind the scenes. But you don't see it, and you don't need to see it, because you're a user. All you need to do here is just pass in some arguments. It'll take care of all the private stuff. It'll start using our private functionality. It can maybe then go ahead and run one of the private functions and execute the behavior that you want and return something. But it's a limited public API, meaning that you're not having to expose everything that's available to the end user, because it doesn't matter to them. I'm going to show you how you can actually use this to implement a system in your application that provides a level of security to stop things breaking. So Facade is a limited readable API. It hides the inner workings of a library, allowing the implementation to be less important. Again, we're using it in jQuery. This allows you to be more creative behind the scenes. The only real difference is that the API, the public API in a facade that's being returned, can greatly differ to what's offered in the module pattern. That's really the only difference. And it has many uses, which we're going to take a look at very soon. Then we have the mediator pattern. How many people here have used PubSub before, or the observer pattern, or some form of that? Okay, so about a third of the people in the room. So the mediator pattern is very, very closely linked to PubSub. It basically encapsulates how disparate modules can interact with each other, acting as an intermediary. And I'd like to explain the mediator pattern using air traffic control as an example. So in air traffic control, we have a tower that handles what planes can take off and what planes can land. You'll never see planes actually communicating with each other about who should be landing first. Can you imagine London Heathrow having like 30 different planes all saying, well, you should be landing first, no, I should be landing after you, and all that stuff happening? That would just be a disaster. Instead, what you do is you have the tower handle all these communications for you. And it's effectively a centralized controller. And that's what the key to this whole system succeeding is, having one central point of communication. So a mediator, when implemented, actually allows you to broadcast, it allows modules to broadcast or listen to notifications without having to worry about the rest of the system. This is effectively PubSub. It allows things to subscribe to different events and broadcast different events. Notifications can be handled by any number of modules at once, again, quite similar to PubSub. And with this type of system, when you integrate it into what I'm going to show you, it's easier for you to add or remove features to a loosely coupled system in such a way that specific modules breaking aren't going to break the rest of your application. That's a beautifully long piece of code that I am not reading. Okay, great. This is what we do, right? If there's a good enough implementation of something, we just steal it and then use it. So let's just use it. This is a very basic example of what we're doing here. So the mediator is essentially centralized PubSub. I'm calling the mediator. I'm saying, okay, well, I want to subscribe to an event of a particular name. Here's my callback with whatever logic I want to execute when someone actually triggers that. So if I say, well, hey, there's a new message. I'm an email app. There's a new message. I might have other parts of my application listening out for that event, and they can then react to that. They can come up with a bubble that says, well, hey, there's a new message. They can change the application. They can actually have notifications coming down and showing you previews of what's going on, etc. So the solution that you can use to build large applications is actually combining a number of patterns. We're going to fix what we've learned in this presentation. We're going to use what we've learned in this presentation to fix this. Right, so we're going to combine the module pattern, and this can mean the module pattern that's in vanilla JavaScript. It can mean A and D if you want. We're going to use the facade pattern and the mediator pattern to get this working. So what do we want? What exactly are we trying to solve? We want an architecture that is very loosely coupled. We don't want modules having to require on 10 different modules in order to work, ideally. We want functionality broken down into independent pieces we can reuse. Something I'm going to mention later is the idea of building applications in a way that is framework or library agnostic, which is developing in a way that I can actually switch out different solutions. From a templating perspective, imagine being able to easily drop handlebars.js and just throw in mustache.js, for example, if they were able to improve their performance and you wanted to use that. Being able to do that in one line of code is quite powerful. Other ideas. So single modules speak to the application when something interesting happens. Right now, we might be developing applications in a way that is not very flexible. You might not necessarily be having specific blocks of modules speaking to each other and perhaps being as loose as possible. And that's a bad way of going about development, especially if you're trying to scale. One of the problems with that is, let's say I have an application that handles deliveries. So I'm Amazon, right? And someone has just ordered something. I'm going to need to send out notifications to the department that's going to handle where that package gets sent out. I'm going to have to send out notifications to the department that is going to actually be fulfilling that order and getting it out to the shipping department, and so on and so forth. Let's say one part of that process failed. Let's say that my message for some reason didn't get to the department that was supposed to go and get it from the warehouse. That entire process falls apart. And that exact same concept can be applied to JavaScript in our applications. One small thing failing due to tight coupling can mean our entire application falls apart. And in large-scale development, we don't want that. We want to be able to work through that problem. So what are we going to use the facade pattern we just looked at for? We're going to use it as an abstraction of an application core. So we're going to have this concept of a main application core that's going to handle a lot of the heavy lifting. The facade is going to be an abstraction of that. It's going to listen out for interesting events and say, great, what happened, give me the details. The more important aspect of this is actually going to be a permissions manager. You might be asking, what the hell is a permissions manager? Well, imagine you have a large application and you have one module that's actually communicating with your backend to do with payments. Payments are understandably quite important. You don't just want anything in your application to be able to get access to those, to be able to read those, to be able to perhaps send data back. Because if anything goes wrong there, you're then going to be liable. Right? What a permissions manager lets you do is it actually allows you to hold permissions for the different modules in your system. So if module A tries communicating and it doesn't actually have a permissions tag saying that it's allowed to do something, it just won't be able to do it. That's it. It won't be able to affect parts of your system that are vulnerable to breakage. And modules are only going to communicate through the facade in order for us to be able to have this permission structure in place. They're only going to be allowed to do things that they're permitted to. Our facade needs to be dependable, especially if everything in our application is going to be piping communications through it. It's important for this to work properly. Like I said, it's going to work as a permissions manager. Think of it as a security guard. And components are only going to be able to call their own methods or methods from within a sandbox. Now this comes back to the whole thing about trying to develop modules in a way that are decoupled, so not depending on other modules where possible. Ideally, if things don't have to touch other things, that means that they can't break them. Then we've got an application core, which is what we're going to be using the mediator pattern for. This is going to manage the module lifecycle. Now, how many times do we actually read about structural solutions these days? Do we ever talk about Backbone managing an application starting or stopping or restarting it? No, we don't. In most books that we read, we don't actually get to hear about this stuff. We don't hear about being able to build applications that are fail-proof, that can actually restart themselves, that can keep going regardless of what happens. Having a mediator in place actually allows you to control that process. If a module dies, I can restart it. I can say, okay, well, how about I pause these other modules, restart the one that's just broken, and keep everything going. So what doesn't the mediator do? Well, it's not its job to decide whether modules should be loading when the DOM is ready. That's something that should be in your module itself, or if you want to break down a module into models using controllers, you can do that. The core should allow you to add or remove new modules without breaking anything. Where is this useful? Consider like the BBC homepage. I can add new widgets dynamically to the BBC homepage if I want to. And technically speaking, those are all sandbox. They don't break anything. Ideally, they shouldn't be breaking anything. Wouldn't it be cool for us to be able to support the same thing? You should also be able to allow your application core to handle detecting and managing errors in your system. So if one of my modules crashes, if something breaks, I should be able to respond to that. My reaction shouldn't just be, oh shit, my application's died. Nobody wants to see that, right? So this is how a mediator might work on its own. You're going to have modules which are essentially broadcasting information, using pub/sub, using the mediator pattern, and they're just going to say, okay, well, something interesting has happened. I'm just going to put that out there. If any other modules in the system want to react to that, they can do so. That's somewhat event-driven programming. If you're not using it at the moment and you haven't looked into it before, do. It's amazing. It's great what you can do without having to worry about bits and pieces of your application falling over because they're directly calling things. So this is how a basic mediator might work. But when we bring the facade pattern into place, we can actually make sure that if something says, okay, well, the order has, so here we've got, again, this whole idea of a delivery system. So we have an order packager, a label manager, a dispatch manager. If the order packager was trying to access a part of the system it wasn't allowed to, when it sends its requests through, and the mediator has to interpret those, this is going to go through our facade. And our facade actually maintains a list, and it says, okay, well, the order packager isn't allowed to access the payment system. Sorry, denied. Can't do anything. But all these other requests can actually go through, okay, without any problem. And modules. We've already covered modules, but their role in this particular architecture is that they're going to inform the application when something interesting happens. They won't be talking to each other directly. Again, I can't stress how important it is for you to consider building applications in a way that individual components aren't talking to each other directly where possible. You're only going to be concerned with publishing events of interest to the rest of the application. So again, we've looked at this before. Modules basically broadcasting, modules subscribing to other events of interest, and that's the workflow for them. And this is essentially what happens when something goes wrong. So let's say that my incoming message manager has crashed and something's gone wrong. I can publish an error notification inside my application because I'm keeping an eye on all the different modules that are running. I can actually say, okay, well, this module isn't running anymore. What's going on? I can pipe back an error notification to my mediator, and it can go and say, okay, well, my incoming message manager has crashed. I'm going to stop all of the other modules in my system that are currently running. I'm going to stop the outgoing message manager. I'm going to say, okay, I've got to restart what crashed. I'm going to then unpause anything else that's been going on, and it keeps working. Nothing crashes. It just keeps on going on and on. From a user's point of view, this hopefully is something which they barely notice. When you're developing applications, if a user doesn't notice when something goes wrong, and you can still keep working, that's perfect. So I'm going to show you an example once more of a to-do application which has integrated these concepts. So I think it's this one. Right, so same application once again. Let's take a look at the actual code for this. So this is my facade. Can everybody see that? Okay. So this is my facade. It's very, very, very simple. All it's doing, and this is a simplistic implementation, but I just want to show you how you can implement this using Backbone. So what I have is, a moment. So this is an implementation of the mediator pattern. All this is actually going to do is when I apply it to an object, it's going to give it subscribe and publish capabilities. This is wrapped using AMD. I have a permission structure. This is a very simple permission structure. This actually controls what bits and pieces of my application are allowed to do. If new content is available, is the module that's actually delivering new content allowed to update the application and say it's available? Yes, it is. If someone has finished editing something in the application, does that have permission to go and save it? Meaning, does it go and update my modules? Is it allowed to do that? Yes, it is. I know these are some trivial examples, but it's just to illustrate this. Now, I've got something interesting to show you. So right now, in here, if I just type in whatever, but you'll see that there's a counter at the very bottom. And the counter keeps updating every single time I add a new item. If I change this to false, and I refresh, what you'll see is that I've just turned off the permissions for that module to render at all. Just using my permission structure. And yet, the rest of my application still works. It doesn't care that one of the other modules in the page have stopped working, or that they've stopped rendering. It's able to continue working. And this is actually quite easy to implement. I mean, it's not the most complex version of this architecture, but all I'm doing here is I'm saying, okay, well, all the logic in my application is going to be based on pub/sub, or the mediator pattern. My facade is going to have a subscribe method. It's going to be able to subscribe to different things going on in the application. And I'm just going to validate anything that comes in against my permissions. If it passes and it's okay, that can then go on and continue the action it was trying to achieve. Otherwise, it's not going to go through. And let me try finding for you what actually changes this. So in our Backbone application, normally what we'd be doing is we'd be tying everything to user interaction. We'd be saying, okay, well, someone has clicked on this button, and I'm going to respond to it with this stuff. And someone has gone and entered in some text. Okay, well, now I'm going to go try to save that, or whatever. This is slightly different. What this is doing is I've deconstructed my entire application into a set of different subscriptions, or broadcasts. So my facade can actually go and subscribe to the content update event. So when someone tries typing in something into the application, and the application tries to update, I can subscribe to that event. And this is the callback. This is actually going to execute the behavior if this gets passed. Something that's a little bit more clear is the to-do saver. If you've just entered in something into your application, if you pressed enter, are you actually going to be allowed to save that to your model? Does that particular block of your application have permission to do that? And this type of thing comes in more into play when you're dealing with much larger applications. You might be having many teams working on different modules for the exact same application. Think about Twitter, for example, or Gmail. And you have to make sure that specific modules have permission to do what they're trying to do. So I can pipe this back. So the facade is going to listen to all the events of interest. These are being called out, or published rather, from here. So here's an example. When someone begins editing something on the screen, you'll notice that I've actually taken, you may notice that I've actually taken away all of my backbone specific logic from here. All this is doing is it's publishing a begin content editing event to the rest of my application. And if I'm allowed to do this, if this passes my permission structure, I can then execute all the logic to do with it. But if I'm not allowed to do it, nothing's going to happen. And when you're talking about much larger applications again, let's say we were dealing with a payment system, this works. It means that nothing can actually touch anything it's not allowed to. So I'm going to show you something now that hasn't been released. I don't know when I am going to release it or it is going to get released, but using this exact same architecture, you can actually build an advanced mediator that has, I guess, abstractions of libraries in it, if you want. Let me show you this, actually. It's better shown. So, similar to what we saw before, this is a facade. This project is called Aura. And this is the facade. It basically has its own set of DOM events that are abstracted from whatever library I'm using. So this is the Dojo and jQuery example I'm showing you. It has its own DOM, it has its own core, it has its own events handler, and it has its own concept of components that are being passed in. Now, in another part of the application, so the jQuery core, I have methods that can go and start modules in my system. I have methods that can start all the modules in my system. I have methods that can stop modules in the system if something breaks and I want to restart it. And I also have my own DOM manipulation. I've got, similar to jQuery's bind and unbind, I have an abstraction of this. Why do I have an abstraction of this? If you develop applications in this way, you can create an individual mediator for every single library you want to support. So here, for example, this is a mediator for jQuery. And I'm just saying, okay, well, if you're going to pass in an element, an event, and a callback, I'm going to pipe this back to jQuery. I'm going to show you the same thing in Dojo in just a moment. So here's a mediator that's been implemented using Dojo. And I've only had to build this once. This is it's not something you have to do every single time, you just build it once and then you can start using it. This is the exact same method, the exact same bind. It's slightly more complicated. This is Dojo, it's slightly more complicated, but it's got the exact same signature. Element, event, callback. And again, this is using the facade pattern for permission structure. It's using the mediator pattern for pub/sub, but it's also using the mediator pattern for abstraction of libraries. And this is what it lets me do. This is another to-do application. I don't actually know what library is currently loading this. Let's find out. So jQuery is currently powering this. jQuery is powering all of the user interaction that's going on. Whenever I click on something and I'm binding to the different bits and pieces of the application to do with someone typing in text, with someone clicking add, or someone interacting with the interface, that's all going through jQuery. Any of the animations that you see when I type in something, I add something new. That's all going through jQuery right now. All of the randomization of colors, jQuery. Yeah, I haven't paid for it. This is the exact same application using Dojo. All I did was I changed one line of code. I didn't have to go retrain all of my staff. I didn't have to go spend a year rewriting this application. All I did was I had one mediator that was written as an abstraction on jQuery with the main methods I'm using there. I had a mediator that was written with abstractions of Dojo with the main methods I'm using there as well. And if I wanted, I could backfill jQuery, my jQuery abstraction, with any of the features that Dojo has, which jQuery doesn't. And I could easily switch them out. If I discovered that there were performance benefits to using specific things in jQuery over Dojo, I could easily switch them out, or vice versa. And all of that was possible in one line of code. All of this stuff is still going through the mediator pattern. All of this stuff is still using the facade. This application will not crash. It's not doing anything overly complex. This application will not crash. I'm able to restart any of the modules in this page. This is actually a separate module. So is this. So is this. So are all of these. And it's very, very easy for me to switch out libraries, which is just one more thing that you can do with this type of architecture. Not necessarily the main reason you use it, but it's just one more thing you can do with it. So what did we learn today? We first of all took a look at architecture. For people who've been building small to medium-sized applications, I hope that covering the MVC, MVP, and MVVM patterns, as well as some of the more detailed aspects of MVC and frameworks were of use. Modularity. We took a look at ES Harmony and some of the stuff we can expect in 2013 when it hopefully gets finalized and starts getting implemented by browser vendors. We also took a look at AMD and solutions that you can use today to start building better, more flexible JavaScript applications that support things like dependencies and dynamic dependencies and better templating, etc. Then we took a look at scalability. So how can we harness design patterns to start building things that are slightly more decoupled, more flexible, and can scale better? Very last part again. Application core, facade, and modules. We have something that can handle all of our modules and make sure that they're constantly running. We have something that can make sure that nothing breaks other parts of our application. And we have modules that are independent units of code. The system has modules that are no longer dependent on each other. They can be managed so that the application doesn't or shouldn't fall over. And you can theoretically pick up any module, drop it in a page, and start using it if you develop things in this way. And that's really it. If you want further reading, I have a number of articles that are available on everything that I've talked about today. They're quite detailed. I am also in the process of writing a book on Backbone with O'Reilly. You can go grab a free version of it on GitHub until we actually publish it. I've also written a book on JavaScript design patterns that you can go get for free as well. And a few other things. So with that, thank you.